Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the book of First Corinthians. So we're going to start there after finishing up reading Romans last week. So let's get a little background information on the book before we get into those first two chapters. Now, this book was written to the church at Corinth by the Apostle Paul. So similar to how Romans was Paul's letter to the church at Rome, it's the same idea here. One interesting thing about this book is that it's one of the few where Paul actually gives us some details of his own life. Some things that you'll notice in this book is that Paul speaks about his own apostleship at great length, and it helps you get to know him as a person. Now, apparently some people at Corinth had said that he wasn't really an apostle because he didn't know Jesus until after Jesus' death and resurrection, and so he is going to correct that here. So he also uses a description of his own ministry to encourage the Corinthians to live godly and open-hearted lives. He describes how he's been honest, hopeful, and devoted while suffering, and how these have blessed him in ministry. So without further ado, let's get right into these first couple of chapters. So Paul begins by greeting the church, the Christians at Corinth. He includes a man named Sosthenes in his greeting, and in Luke's account of Paul's time in Corinth, Sosthenes is actually a synagogue leader who gets beaten up by a crowd that was really waiting to attack Paul. So if this is the same man, and we can assume that it most likely was, he's now become a trusted Christian brother. Now, Paul highlights the holiness and unity that all Christians share, not by their own efforts, but through belonging to Jesus Christ. He thanks God for their exciting progress and spiritual gifts. But Paul has heard that there are some arguments in the church. Paul has heard from some of the people that there are quarrels and splits in the church at Corinth. The believers are naming themselves after their favorite leader, Paul, Apollos, Cephas, Peter, or even Christ. And the Corinthians want their church leaders to be impressive. Peter has a big personality, and Apollos is a brilliant speaker, but Paul disappoints them. He's a small man with poor health and a stutter. Paul tells the Corinthians that they're looking for the wrong things in their leaders and in themselves. The message of Jesus is that God takes foolish, humble, and even weak people and gives them the wisdom and the power of Christ. Jesus didn't look very powerful or sound very eloquent when he hung on the cross. Jews saw his death as a scandal. No Messiah would ever let that happen to him. And the Greeks saw his death as ridiculous, not at all godlike. Why would a God who has so much power allow this to happen to himself? But Paul says the death of Jesus was the wisest and the most powerful thing that God has ever done. And if we're looking for something to boast about, then we should only boast that Jesus died for us. And then we come to chapter 2. Paul, really in verses 6 to 16, he sees a huge difference between human wisdom and God's wisdom. God's wisdom has nothing to do with pride or cleverness. It's about perceiving spiritual truth, and that alone. If the secular rulers had possessed such insight, they would never have crucified Jesus. And yet God's wisdom is most clearly seen in situations of weakness and suffering. Now, it's God's Spirit who knows God's wisdom, just as a person's thoughts are known by that person alone. But this same Spirit has been given to every Christian. It is God's Spirit within us that gives us spiritual wisdom and shows us the thoughts and the purposes of Christ. So what that really means, and what chapter 2 really focuses on, is that there are some things that simply can't be understood by human means, only by the Spirit of God. Verses 14 to 16 show us that the spiritual man understands things while the natural man never can. And this is certainly played out in our world today too. I think it's very difficult, if not impossible, to be a wise person now without a relationship with God. And because God, when we have that relationship, lets his Spirit move through us. And the reason for that is God is the master of this world. He's our creator and he's the Lord. And if we don't see him, and if we don't see everything through the lens that he's provided for us, it's impossible to see the full picture. And when I say that, I think of that scene from National Treasure, if you've ever seen it, where Nicolas Cage is looking through those glasses and there's those two different types of lenses, and if he moves them a certain way, you can see a certain thing. And I think that's the way the world is. When you know God and when you have that relationship with the Lord and you can see things through his perspective, when you have that biblical worldview, you can understand things in a way that no one else can. And that, I think, is what Paul wants the Corinthians to grasp here. And that's what I think the message here is when he talks about the natural man versus the spiritual man. So that's all for today in Corinthians. I'll see you tomorrow back in the book of Genesis.